And so this summer we are going through the book of Philippians, and we have actually a number of people who are going to be speaking alongside this summer. You can see some of them here. William, there he is. Hey, buddy. A couple people you might not know of. There's a guy named Sean Maxwell. Has anybody ever heard of the Church of 1122? Okay, all right, so 1.5 people. Okay, good. No, it's this incredible thing that God's doing in Jacksonville. I mean, they have so many campuses. It's 10,000, 15,000 people. He is their COO and one of their pastors, so we had the opportunity to hear him speak. My friend Shannon Butler. Shannon is the FAMU's. He works at Calvary Chapel right now, and he is also the chaplain for the FAMU football team, and so he's going to come and preach for us one time. Part of what's happening this summer, by the way, is I'm going to do something that I haven't done in a long time, which is I'm taking most of the book of Philippians, the first 8 weeks, or the next 8 weeks, off from preaching. For the first 4, and I'm just telling you this because you'll come to church and you'll think, man, where's Ben? We have make sure you have a ton of incredible communicators that are going to come and preach and teach, and that I'm excited to be a part of as well, and sit. And I'm like, finally, I get to sit under some good teaching, Some of you were like, yes. For the first 4 weeks, honestly, the pace of church has been so crazy over the last 1.5 years that if you know me, then you know I'm bivocational. I run our family's meat company at the same time I pastor this church. And so for the first 4 weeks, I'm going to be exclusively focusing on the meat company. I'm still going to be around. I'm still going to be here. And for the second 4 weeks, if you were here in January, we went through our vision. And the whole thing around our vision is it's this idea that God has given us this place at this time in this city to be a light to our city in such a way that we would love and serve our city, that it draws our city to God. That they wouldn't look at us and say, okay, we only know you for what you believe, but we actually have seen the way that you live. We actually have seen the way that you serve. We actually have seen the way that you love, and we believe that you believe, and we want to hear more about your God. And that takes planning. It takes preparation. There's a lot of outreach things that we have. There's a lot of infrastructural things that we're planning and we're tinkering with. And honestly, sermon writing and content development for me, it takes so much time and energy that I'll be able to spend the second 4 weeks just working on the ministry. Not working in the ministry, working on the ministry. And the dream behind this is that you get to hear some great communicators, and it allows me the time to really focus on helping our church for the next chapter of the life of our church. So I just want to give you a heads up. That's what's going to be happening for the next 8 weeks. Still going to be here, still going to be around. You can text me if you want to. Okay, let's pray. Jesus, thank you so much for this time that we have together. As we study your word, as we go through this book of Esther, God, would you speak to each and every one of us, no matter where we are in our relationship with you. For those of us who walked in, and it's the very first time in a long time that we've been to a church or a place like this, God, would you just make today specific and individual for us? And for those of us who walked in and have been faithfully following you or faithfully doing our best to follow you for a long time, God, would you speak to us and make today clear and true and fresh in our lives? We pray that you would do this all by the power of your Holy Spirit, Jesus. Amen. So we're in this book of Esther. If you've been tracking with us, then you might are caught up with this, but I want to do a little bit of a recap because today is kind of tying all of the book of Esther together from what we started at week 1 to week 2 to where we're going this week. And we started off with 2 big observations. Esther, number 1, is in the Old Testament. That's not the first observation. That's just context. It's in the Old Testament. It's all pre-Jesus. And there's 2 things that are significant, or 2 specific things for our text that are relevant in the book of Esther. Number 1 is this: there is no direct mention of God. It's the only book, or one of the only 2 books in the Bible that there's no direct mention of God. And number 2 is that there's no transcendent event that happens. And by transcendent event, I don't mean that transcendence isn't involved. I mean this like direct, clear, thus saith the Lord, God said, here's what the prophet said, here's the sea that parted, here's the bush that was burning and it was on fire, but it wasn't consumed. It seems like in the Old Testament, when God works, it's this massive work, it's this clear divine prophetic message. But the book of Esther has no sense of this inexplicable, divine, abnormal reality. And at the same time, it doesn't mention God. And so we have to ask ourselves, why? Did they just forget? Well, obviously not. It's as if the writer was writing and saying, okay, I want to invite you in. It's a rhetorical device to invite us in, to lean in and say, okay, how can we see God? How can we see God in the ordinary? How can we see God in the normal stuff of life? How can we see God? Because when you go to the office on Monday, you're not going in and thinking, okay, I'm expecting to see a burning copy machine, right? And the copier it's on fire, but it's not consumed. For some of you, you're like, I hope it's on fire and consumed, because that thing is maddening. But what I love about this is this book that was written thousands of years ago hits us directly where we are. Because we hope that God's working, we think that God's moving, but oftentimes it's really, really difficult to see, and we really don't know where it is, and we really don't know the hand of God, and there's not these crazy, divine, miraculous things that happen. And Esther was a Jewish girl, a Jewish orphan, raised by her cousin Mordecai, living in Persia, in the capital of the Persian Empire. Esther, through basically a beauty pageant, a bachelor-type show, becomes queen to the king. In week 1, we stopped and we said this, that the first thing to know about Esther, as we're looking at this book, as we're looking at the text, as we're looking at the context, saying, okay, how do we understand how we interface in the normalcy of life, the everyday of life, the 9 to 5 of life, in the places that don't seem like they have this direct spiritual revelation from God? How do we see God? And the first thing is to see Esther as a human being. Most times when we preach through Esther, we create Esther to be this example of perfection. But to realize that Esther, in the first 2 chapters, Esther hid her religion, did not pay attention to Jewish dietary law, slept with the man before she was married, and married a husband who was not a believer. So she wasn't perfect. And that's not to be like, hey, let's just throw shade on Esther today. It's to come to this realization that all of us, this invites all of us in, because if Esther is perfect, if Esther is the example, and if Esther has nothing wrong, then you and I mean, good luck, right? But Esther is a person who has failed and hidden. And in fact, at this point, nobody even knows that she's Jewish except for her cousin Mordecai. Well, so this crazy thing happens. She becomes queen. Mordecai, her cousin, who raised her, is at the gate, and he hears these two Persian officials plotting to kill the king. He tells Esther, lets the king know. The king does some stuff, and the people are executed for it. But Mordecai's kind of forgotten. Well, in steps the evil villain of the story. And again, you know how this is. Every story has that villain. Every story has that person. Every story has that Liam Neeson whose daughter is tied to the bomb. And is he going to get her in time? And so that is Haman. Haman steps in the page. Haman is the second to the king. The Haman gets this massive promotion above all of his peers. And Haman is so obsessed with power that Haman has the king edict that everybody should bow down to him. But the problem is, and I'm going to recap this a little bit in chapter 3, is that in the middle of this, Mordecai says, no, I'm not going to bow down. If you got your Bible, you can go to Esther. It's in chapter 3. I'm going to just do a couple quick verses. Verse 3, it says, the king's servants who were at the king's gate, they said to Mordecai, why do you transgress the king's command? In other words, Mordecai, why do you continually not bow down? And when they spoke to him day after day, he would not listen to them. They told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. It's the closest thing to a religious connotation we have. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, he was filled with fury. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So as they made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. Now it's interesting, because you have Queen Esther, or Esther, who is the queen, who is a Jew who no one knows. Mordecai, the cousin, who has just saved the king. But now the second in command under the king hates the man who saved the king, and not only wants to kill him, wants to kill all of them. Unbeknownst to him is also Queen Esther. And so, like we read last week, Mordecai talks to Esther and says, Esther, you got to talk to the king. And she says, no. If I talk to the king could kill me. If I talk to the king, who knows what the king's going to say? Because unless he calls me into his presence, then no one can go in his presence. Mordecai, you know this. Everybody knows this. If I do that, then I might die. And Mordecai says back, if you don't do this, that God's still going to do what he's going to do, that salvation will still come to the Jews. But I want you to know this. In the middle of that, if you don't, you will die. And who knows? Maybe God has put you in this place for such a time as this. And this was the whole thing we said. Is that when we're looking and we're trying to figure out how do we live for God in the context of this life where there isn't all this explicit spirituality, but at the same time, everything we do has some type of a divine sense of spirituality to it. And how do I live in a non-spiritual context in a way that is for God? It's to know that, number one, you're not perfect. But number two, you do have a place. Queen Esther had a place in the palace. And she was forced to make this decision. Will I use my place for the purpose God has called me to? Or will your purpose become keeping your place in the palace? We said this for all of us. You have a place in the places and spaces that God's given. You have a place in your family. You have a place in your friend group. You have a place at work. You have a place in your gym. You have a place at whatever and wherever and with whomever God has you in and with. You have a place, and you are specifically located in that place for a reason that you're uniquely kind of positioned to be a person, to be a light in that place. And that's the purpose that God has called you. But if I'm not careful, my purpose becomes my place, which is why I'm oftentimes concerned about leveraging my place for the purpose of God. And so as the story goes on from there, it takes some interesting turns. So what we then see is he has just said that you need to go do this. She says, okay, I'm going to go pray. I want you guys to pray with me. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw this feast. I'm going to throw this feast, but it's just going to be for the king and for Haman. She sets one of two dinners up. And I think she's doing it intentionally because she's like, you know what? I can't make this big request night one because I'm going to ask him to counteract what the second highest command has said. And I'm going to ask him to save all the Jews. And I haven't seen him for 30 days. I don't know if he's upset with me or not. And so I'm just going to have dinner at first, and then we're going to set it up for the second night. And so Queen Esther throws this feast for the king. In the middle of this feast, the king says, Esther, what do you want? I will give you up to half the kingdom. And Esther responds and says, here's what I want. I want you and Haman to come back tomorrow night. And tomorrow night, I'm going to throw you another feast. It's going to be special, just for you two. And there I'll make my request. Well, this interesting thing happens between these two nights, between these two feasts. Haman leaves. I want to get the interaction that happens as Haman has just left the party with Esther. In chapter 5, verse 9. So Haman went out that day joyfully, glad of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai at the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before. In other words, he didn't stand up in honor, and he wasn't scared of him at all, but he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and he brought his friends and his wife Zeresh. And Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches. And don't you want a friend like Haman who's like, hey, I just went to this thing. I had this little interaction. Hey, get my wife, get all my friends on. Let me tell y'all how rich I am. It's an amazing time. The number of his sons, all the promotions with which the king had honored him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and the servants of the king. And then Haman said, even Queen Esther, let no one but me come with the king to the feast she prepared. And tomorrow also I am invited by her together with the king. She says, I got all this stuff. It's amazing. It's incredible. Yet all this is worth nothing to me, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. So this stuff is great. This stuff is amazing. This stuff is incredible. I have all these riches. I have all this splendor. I have all this glory. I have all of this, these sons. I have this inheritance that will go forward in my name. I even have the king's favor. I even have the king's wife's favor. In fact, she threw a party for me, and she's throwing another party for us tomorrow. Well, you know what? But you know what? Really, all of that is nothing because of Mordecai. Let me say this. That sounds so silly, doesn't it? We're like, man, I am so refined, I would never think that. Until you go to somebody's house who's bigger and nicer than yours is, and you man, I wish I had that house. I have this family. It's beautiful. They're incredible. Well, they're sometimes incredible. Honestly, sometimes they're nightmares. But collectively, I really like them a lot. I've got this career. It's going pretty well. I mean, things are going good. Financially, I mean, I always kind of wish I was further along than where I was, but I'm not displeased with where I am. We're doing pretty well. We're doing pretty good for ourselves. Life is pretty good. And then you go to their house and you're like, how is their closet as big as our bedroom? What kind of countertops do y'all have? And how often do you get them replaced? Tell me again about that new pool that you've got. Good grief, right? Like you see that, or you see their car. You're like, man, I liked my car until I saw your car, right? Or man, I felt like I was attractive until he walked in or until she walked in, right? And then all of a sudden, and I felt my kids were great. And then I met their kids. And they said, yes, sir. I had to slap my kids, Not really, that's abuse. But you know what I'm saying? Like, come on. What gets in our way, ultimately, at the core of it, of using our place in the palace for the purpose of God is our pride. What actually gets in the way of using our place for the purpose of God is our pride. It's this over-focus on self. C.S. Lewis has this beautiful quote. He defines pride in a specific way that I thought, man, in fact, we're going to go to C.S. Lewis a lot. And I just want to say, too, I almost don't want to say this out loud, but a lot of this sermon was inspired by Tim Keller, who passed away a few days ago. And, man, he was just like a pastor to every pastor. And so just, I don't know. I just feel like I should say that. It's what C.S. Lewis says about pride. Pride is the ruthless, sleepless, unsmiling concentration on self. Ruthless, sleepless, unsmiling concentration on self. And it can be both in the positive and the negative. It can be a place of superiority and inferiority. That's what I mean by that. Some of us, it's this ruthless, sleepless, unwavering sense of focus, unsmiling sense of focus on ourselves. And we're just so happy about it because we want to be better than everybody else around us. And you were good with you until you saw somebody that was better than you or had more than you or had that thing that you valued or cherished more than you. Or you saw somebody who, this is the big one, you saw someone who got praise of those who you find praiseworthy and you wanted that too. To be treasured above all else, I heard this quote, is the praise of those we find praiseworthy. It's also in the negative sense. It's a negative view of self. It's, oh, I'm terrible. Oh, I wish I was better. Oh, I know I'm not that good. Oh, I know I'm horrible. Oh, if only I could do better. If only I could be better. It's this negative view of self as much as this positive view of self because it's simply an overly focused view of self. The story continues, and we see Haman's pride continue to become significant. On that night, the king couldn't sleep. Interesting thing that happens. He gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, as they were read before the king. And it was found written how Mordecai had told Bigthana, Bible names, I'm telling you, man. And Teresh, you just say it with confidence. If you're ever in a Bible study, I heard this one guy say, he talks about Nehemiah, he called him Nehemiah. I'm like, bro, that's it from now on. Just say it with confidence with your chest. The king said, and Teresh, who were two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, what honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this. Well, the king's young men who attended him said, nothing has been done for him. So Mordecai's kind of been forgotten about this point. Again, this is the silent providential hand of God. The king said, who is it that enters the court? And Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged from the gallows that he had prepared for him. So Mordecai walks in and saying, hey, let's hang this dude. And the king has a totally different agenda. They told him that Haman is here, standing in the court. And the king said, let him come in. So Haman came in. And the king said, what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? What should be done for him? This is for Haman. This is his chance. And Haman said to the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn. In other words, make him like a king. Let the royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden, on whose head a royal crown is set. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man who the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Haman is thinking, it's me. The king's going to honor me. Okay, so what do I want? I think I want a horse. I think I want a new car. I want a new set of clothes. In fact, I want a new crown. And in fact, actually not new. Let me just take yours, king. And by the way, not like, we use in this like Gen Z term, what's up, young king? It's like, no, like legitimate king, right? Like let me take your stuff. And then I want you to give all of that to the highest noble. And I want the highest noble to lead around in the city. The highest of all your officials, so that the people can see that the man that the king delights to honor is a man whom is so far above everyone else that even the highest close to him is like his servant. King says that's a great idea. Then the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robes, the horses you have said, and do so too. And I feel like at this point he's like, yep. Mordecai, the Jew, who sits at the king's gate, and leave out nothing that you have mentioned. Well, so Haman has nothing to do except for this. So he leads him around. And he has felt this sense of pride, this sense of boasting and kind of bombastic sense of self. This description that Lewis puts to it says this. It said, pride gets no pleasure out of having something, only out of having more of it than the next man. We say that people are proud of being rich or clever or good looking, but they are not. They are proud of being richer, cleverer, or better looking than others. If everyone else became equally rich or clever or good looking, there would be nothing to be proud about. It is the comparison that makes you proud, the pleasure of being above the rest. See, that's what we really want. And can I tell you this? Here's the wild thing. And we're going to get to Esther and finish the story in just 1 second. But here's the wild thing. What Haman was really wanting was a sense of purpose and value. What he really wanted was a sense of purpose and value. And he thought through all these externalities, that's how I achieve this. Can I tell you? The Bible's clear that God has put eternity in our heart, that there's something inside of each one of us, even if our purpose and our value is simply contentment. That God has put inside of each one of us a sense of we are longing for something, looking for something to drive value, significance, worth, and importance, to tell us that we're okay. And I believe fully that that is the thumbprint of God, that we are made in His image. And if we are made in His image, but sin has separated us from Him, then there's something of our image that is incomplete unless we have Him, that our soul continues to look for Him. And so what we actually see is that Haman, funny enough, is not looking for the wrong thing. He's actually just looking for it from the wrong king. He thinks if I get all of this other stuff, that I'll be fine. Then that hole inside of me, that thing inside of me, that thing that looks as if I have all of this stuff, but for some reason, why am I still unhappy? Like, how many of us, we've asked that question before? You looked around and thought, my life is great. My life is, I feel like I should be happy. And I'm not. I don't know what's wrong with me. Well, perhaps. You want the right thing. But what the gospel says is that you have value and you have worth, but not because you're good enough and not because you're perfect. Because, again, any economics 101 will tell you, price is determined, value is determined by what someone else is willing to pay for it. We don't have value because of the externalities of what we have. We have value because we have God. And how much value do we have? If God would say that we are valuable enough, even in our sinful state, that He would send His Son to die for us, then that's the value that we have, the Son of God. His name is Jesus. And that thing that we're looking for comes from the King, but His name is Jesus. Not Assurus or Xerxes or whatever His name is. Certainly not 401ks and beach houses and successful careers. So he looks at him. He says, I want you to lead him around. Well, so if Haman is the essence of what pride drives us to, then Esther in chapter 7 gives us the essence of humility. By the way, right before this, Haman tells everybody about this. He's so furious about it. He says, okay, this is absurd. His wife says, why don't you build basically this gallows, this operation to either impale or to hang him? Why don't you build one of those 50 feet high? And so Haman comes in, and he's planning again on having this conversation. Before that, now all of a sudden, this whole thing is thrown off. So now he's at this second dinner. His wife has just told him, here's a problem, that you're going down, and Mordecai's coming up. So verse 1, the king and Haman went into the feast with Queen Esther. And on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king again said to Esther, he said to her, what is it you wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled. So Queen Esther answered, after her time, after her thought, after her prayer, after she has said, okay, if I perish, I perish. I realize that I am meant in this place for a purpose, that I didn't get into this place for a purpose. I didn't get into this place because I was perfect, but nonetheless, God has me in this place for a purpose, and here is my purpose. If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. The king's like, what? Now again, the king has no clue that she's Jewish. Haman had no clue that she was Jewish. She has kind of held it secret till this time. And if we had been merely sold as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent. In other words, king, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss of the king. In other words, king, if we had just been sold as slaves, honestly, I wouldn't even have bothered you. But we're about to die. Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, who is he and where is he? Who has dared to do this? I love how now she is so incredibly smart. She knows that if I just say, oh, here's what Haman did. King, let me tell you the situation that I am. Let me tell you how unfair something has happened. I can't believe it. What happened? Who is it? I'm glad you asked. A foe, an enemy, the wicked Haman. And Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king arose and in his wrath from the wine drinking and went into the palace garden, which you know is when you're ticked, right? When you're like, man, I can't even drink wine anymore. I need to go to the garden for a minute, right? Like he goes into the garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life for Queen Esther. So Haman's like, no, I can't even go to the king because I know the king's already decided. So I need to plead with Esther that she would save me. For he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. The king returned from his palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine. And as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was, that's a really weird way to say that. But what basically all scholars kind of, they pick that sentence apart. What they're saying is that he was in such this worked up state, and reasonably so, that he's pleading, he's begging, he's not just at her feet, that he actually at some point, like as the king's walking in, the king sees Haman falling on Queen Esther, and he's like, "Sir, you thought that was bad." King said, "Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house? Bro, what is wrong with you?" As the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance of the king, said, "Moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, who saved the king, is standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high." And the king said, "Hang him on that." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the wrath of the king abated. And they come up with this brilliant plan to now send letters everywhere, all over the empire, that when the day happens, the Jews who were going to be annihilated can now take weapons, they can now defend themselves. This letter goes out and the entire place is saved. In fact, it's so incredible that what the king does is the king sees Mordecai in his leadership and promotes Mordecai to Haman's place. It's this beautiful story. I tell you, you should read the Bible. It's pretty fun. And I just want to read this last verse as we're kind of like closing this whole thing. In fact, it's the last verse of the entire book. And this is, I think, the point of the whole thing. This is, I think, when we look at our place, when we look at our purpose, when we look at pride, this is the thing that I think is at the essence or the source or the center of the book of Esther. Because again, she was raised by Mordecai, infused with his thought, his attitudes, his postures, his cultures, his values. And this is what it says about Mordecai in the very last verse of chapter 10, verse 3. For Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Ahasuerus. And he was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers. In other words, he was great and he was popular. He had both of those things. But why? For he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people. It says because he saw his people. He saw this group. He said, I'm not going to use my place to serve myself and to fuel my pride. I'm going to use my place, and I'm going to seek the welfare of the people. And I'm going to seek the peace of all the people around me. The silent sovereign hand of God, the silent continual working of our Father in the normalcy of our lives, in the normalcy of the day-to-day rigors. It's seen and displayed this way most perfectly, most prominently, and in fact, this was the call of Jesus. That we would not spend our lives wanting to be served to fuel our pride, but we would realize that we have been served by God through the person of Jesus. And so now what we do is as people who have been served, we then serve other people. What does it look like to live out the book of Esther? It looks like every place we go to, it's Philippians 2:3, do nothing out of selfish ambition and vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. Each one of us should look not only to the interest of ourselves, but also to the interest of others. It's this sense that the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. This was the Old Testament. This was the New Testament. This was the call of the people of God. And the primary competitor for our purpose is our pride. You will either serve other people in the name of Jesus, or you will expect other people to serve you and treat you like you're Jesus. I'm going to end with these two quotes. Well, it's really kind of one long one from C.S. And this is great because I love it because he doesn't really say. So much time when we talk about pride, it's not the sense of, okay, here's what humility looks like then. And people will say, it's not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. That's a pretty common quote. And I think that's really true. And I'll just say this is the last thing, but let me just say one really quick thing about that, why that's so important. It's not thinking less of yourself. Because if you think less of yourself, you'll actually deny your place number one. And number two is God has given you a gifting and a wiring and an ability. And if you minimize that or degrade that, then you actually won't realize what God has called you to. In other words, the gospel says, Luke says, to whom much is given, much is required. Well, if I continually deny that I've been given anything, I don't feel like anything is required of me. And so it's not to me to say, oh no, oh no, oh no. I mean, it's to me to say, yeah, God's given me some gifts and God's given me abilities, but it has nothing to do with me. Lewis says this, do not imagine that if you meet a really humble man, that he will be what most people call humble nowadays. He will not be a sort of, and these two words that we wouldn't really think of because it's a little bit different time, a sort of greasy, smarmy person. Everybody's like, I have seen so many greasy, smarmy people, right? That just kind of means this person has this overly kind of almost disingenuous sense of self-deprecation. Who is always telling you that, of course, he is nobody. Probably all you will think of him is that he seemed a cheerful, intelligent chap who took a real interest in what you said to him. If you dislike him, it will be because you'll feel a little envious of anyone who seems to enjoy life so easily. He will not be thinking about humility. He will not be thinking about himself at all. And if anyone would like to acquire humility, I think I tell him the first step. The first step is to realize that one is proud. He continues on a little while later and he says, the point is this. He wants you to know him. Wants to give you himself. Not wants you to give, wants to give you. And he and you and two things of such a kind that if you really get into any kind of touch with him, you will in fact be humble, delightedly humble, feeling the infinite relief of having for once, and I love this, feeling the infinite relief of having for once got rid of all the silly nonsense about your dignity which has made you restless and unhappy all your life. We fill our lives with these externalities that we think is going to drive value, and at the end of the day, they just don't. And we have a choice that we can either realize that I have a place, and God has called me to a purpose, and I will not let pride to come in the way of that, but I will decide that I will humble myself. I will not think less of myself. I will realize that I serve an incredible God. I serve an amazing God. I serve a God who hung the stars in the sky and calls each one of them by name. I have had the God who is infinitely big, yet at the same time the God of B minor and of so many different versions of insects, right? Like, I serve this incredible, magnificent God, and I feel value because of that God, not because of the things that this God has created, the creation, and that I can just amass all this stuff, and I could be so clever, and I could be so beautiful, and I could be so rich, and I could be so successful, and I have such a wonderful family. And then we go through a midlife crisis, and we think, what in the world are we doing on this planet? But it's purpose. Our purpose was to know him and to glorify him. And to glorify him by serving the people around us. The book of Esther practically and functionally looks like Jesus, who did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. So here's the decision. It's not to decide, now I'm going to go serve. We serve because we have been served. We love because we have been loved. And it's only from the overflow of that does true, genuine love and service to the world around us come. So the best way we could think to finish this together was not to make a declaration of service. Was not to make a declaration of what we're going to go do and where we're going to go do it. But it's simply to take communion together. Because on the night that Jesus died, he got his closest followers together and said, this is my body which is broken for you. This is my blood which is shed for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Remembrance of the way that I loved you. Remembrance of the way that I served you, because I'm going to call you to do the same. But first you have to spend time being served and being loved. My hope is that we experience love from God the realization that I'm served by God, that I have value and purpose from God, and I display that to the rest of the world, but not because of our self-righteous ability to go and do and be, but because God is everything, and he died for us. I'm going to pray for us, and we're going to take communion together. If you've been here, the way that we do that is just kind of as we're singing this last song, as you feel ready and prepared, you just come and you take a piece of the bread, and you dip it in the cup, and you just spend some time in prayer, focusing and praying, and experiencing the love of God, who so loved us, he gave his son for us, though we didn't deserve it. So Jesus, we thank you. We thank you that the book of Esther is this shining example, that none of us are perfect, but all of us have a place. And a lot of us even get into the place that we're in for a purpose, but that doesn't deny the reality that, God, though sometimes we can't see you, and sometimes we wonder if you're there, and sometimes we wonder where you are in the midst of all this, you have given us this book that we can lean in and see you clearly. And the way that we can pull ourselves back and see you working in the book of Esther, we can pull ourselves back and see how you have worked providentially through our lives. But God, I pray that our goal is not to leave here, to go and be more selfless, to go and serve because we are good enough people. But it's the realization that we're not, that we are selfish, that we are prideful, and we were never supposed to be perfect. And Jesus, you came and died because of that. Because we're not. You died for a rebellious group of people like us. You loved us and you served us when none of us deserved it. And God, if you, an amazing, incredible God, would do that for us, then we give everything back to you. Help us to see our place. Help us to see our purpose. And help us to not get distracted by our pride, but instead we would be compelled by your love, Jesus, to love a lost and a hurting and a broken world because you loved a lost and a hurting and a broken me. So would you allow us to just sit in the presence of your love and your service this morning for a few minutes? And then would you give us the clarity to go live and love and serve as we have been loved and served by the King.